All right, why don't we go ahead and begin now? Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council's program with guest speaker Dr. Robert Assadi. Thanks to Dr. Assadi and to everyone who has joined us online today. I am Bill Reisinger, Professor of Political Science at the University of Iowa, Treasurer and Board Member of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council. I will be hosting today's program. We're very grateful to our annual donors, members, sponsors, and partners for their support. They include the Iowa Arts Council through the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, the Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities, the University of Iowa's International Programs, Honors Program, and Public Policy Center, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, and Midwest One Bank, as well as City Channel 4 for providing online access to ICFRC's programs, along with the UI Library Archives. ICFRC has adopted the Native American Land Acknowledgment prepared for the City of Iowa City's Ad Hoc Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Human Rights Commission. We recognize that our home community of Iowa City now occupies the homelands of Native American nations to whom we owe our commitment and dedication. The full text of our acknowledgement is on our website at icfrc.org. As we get started, please make sure you know where your video and audio mute buttons are located. We ask you to please keep your audio and video turned off for the duration of the presentation so you do not interrupt the speaker. Following our speaker's presentation at about 12:45, we will have a 15-minute Q&A. You will be able to submit your questions via the chat function. At that time, we will invite you to turn on your video, but please keep your audio muted to avoid any background noise. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Assadi, who will speak about post-revolutionary Iran. Dr. Assadi is an instructor in the Department of Political Science at Portland Community College in Portland, Oregon. He holds an MA and Ph.D. in political science from the University of Minnesota. But he actually holds a much more impressive academic credential. He received his BS in political science from the University of Iowa. That's right, he's a Hawkeye, an alumnus of my department. And it's always a true pleasure to find out that a former student has followed through well on what he learned here. I actually got to know Robert not through a class, but because he participated in a study abroad program at the Moscow State Institute for International Relations, or MGIMO, the university that trains Russia's diplomats. This was 15 years ago in the summer of 2007. I flew to Moscow with the participants and stayed for the first part of the program. Robert not only did well in his classes, but was a model citizen ambassador. Very polite, you might say very Iowa nice. While he specialized in Iranian politics, his knowledge of international affairs does not stop there. In fact, with the growing closeness between Russia and Iran, his time in Moscow may be even more relevant. In any case, Iran is of critical significance for US foreign policy and global affairs, yet far too few scholars and policymakers have expertise on it. We are very fortunate, therefore, to have with us today someone who is a specialist on Iranian politics. I commend to you Dr. Assadi's book, Post-Revolutionary Iran, The Leader, the People, and the Three Powers, which has just been released in paperback this month. It's a terrific overview of both the institutions of Iranian politics and the informal patterns. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Assadi.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's great to see you again. It's hard to believe it's been 15 years since that trip, which I remember very fondly and was very influential in my life. So it's great to be with you. Also, thank you to Catherine for organizing so much of this talk. And thank you to everyone who is here. I look forward to the Q&A. And hopefully you find something useful in what I'll share in the next 35 minutes or so. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and get started. So as Bill was kind enough to mention, what I'll be speaking with you about today is a broad overview of some of the ideas that are outlined in my book, which was written really in 2019, 2020. It came out initially in April of 2021, and the paperback just came out earlier this month, as Bill mentioned. If you're interested, you can find it on Amazon, or the publisher's website has this discount code if you decide to purchase it there. So that's what the book looks like. I can maybe say a little bit about what led me to write this particular book, or to think about post-revolutionary Iran in the way that I do in the book. And it's actually a kind of interesting story from just a political scientist's point of view. My own areas of expertise in political science are international relations and comparative politics. My dissertation was also on Iran, but much more from an IR, or international relations, point of view. But then, like many young academics, I was required to teach many sections of American government when I first started in 2015. And so I read several, skimmed several dozen introductory texts on American government. And I was struck by how these texts really lead with trying to understand the institutional configuration of the American political system. Why was this striking to me? Well, because much of my reading on Iran had focused so much more on political culture, religion, the idea that, well, the institutions don't really matter, so we don't need to concern ourselves with how they're configured. And so, getting started on this in 2019, on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, I took it as an opportunity to revisit the foundational text, Iran's constitution, see what are the conditions of possibility, or what are the possible future outcomes embedded in the constitutional order itself, and how can we think about this particular juncture in Iran's post-revolutionary history, now 43 plus years after the revolution, really as one contingent outcome among many. And what are the conditions for possible futures? Can Iran's political system reform in any meaningful way, short of complete systemic change? So those were some of the questions that I was interested in. The three powers in the subtitle of the book is a phrase drawn specifically from the Constitution itself. And the three powers refer to executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. So, of course, sounds very familiar to our ears as Westerners. And so I became interested in how are these branches constitutionally empowered? What's their relationship to the position of the leader, or sometimes we refer to as the supreme leader? Iran's constitution only refers to that individual as the leader. And where amongst all of this are the Iranian people themselves. So I have a chapter in the book on social movements. And so I like the image on the cover in that it's kind of showing the people, and above them is the flag. Maybe we could take that as symbolizing the regime. And what's the push and pull in that relationship between state and society, which is a really critical feature when we study regime type in political science. So just a little context by way of introduction. Very quickly, I'll go through this primer. The Iowa City Foreign Relations Council audience, I'm sure you are all well acquainted with Iran's political system, or I'm aware that this is not an audience that maybe has no background knowledge, but just to give you a very quick background, this graphic is one that I use with my students. It was produced by the National Democratic Institute, I think around 2008 or 2009, around the 2009 presidential election. And so what you see here is starting with the voters, starting with the Iranian people. They directly vote for members of a 290 person parliament, or majlis in Persian. They also directly elect a president who serves a 4-year term. That president appoints a cabinet drawn from members of parliament. Voters also directly elect members to a body called the Assembly of Experts. The Assembly of Experts is tasked with appointing the supreme leader in the case that that person dies or becomes incapacitated in some way that they can no longer fulfill the functions of their office. That has only ever happened once in Iran's post-revolutionary history in 1989, when the first supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, died, and the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, was selected by that body. We can talk about it in the Q&A if you're interested, but there's a lot of discussion now in Iran about the future of a possible succession to a third supreme leader. Ayatollah Khamenei is 83 years old. He'll be 84 in April of next year. He has had some pretty grave health issues recently. He had a recent surgery for a bowel obstruction. And actually just a few days ago, he made kind of his first public appearance in some time at a religious ceremony. And so that was viewed very much through the lens of him trying to show that he's still well and he's still performing his roles as leader. So what I think is important to show in this graphic is that there is a role for voters. That role is constrained. There are some similarities to what we would think of as, democratic systems of government, in that, there's a parliament, which actually goes back to the first decade of the 20th century, when Iran had their first 20th century revolution. That was the constitutional revolution of 1905-06. There's an elected president, and yet there are bodies that are either not accountable to the public or kind of insulated or have some degrees of removal from the public, such as the supreme leader, his advisory councils, the military, religious institutions, the courts, and the media, and so on. So happy to speak more about this if you have questions, but just to give a little context of what I'll be speaking about in the next few minutes. So in the book, I begin by surveying the argument that, if you read any literature about Iran in public policy, or, even in the academic literature, you come across this argument again and again that the only way Iran can reform is through regime change. So I call this the regime change argument. And what I try to do in the book is, as honestly and comprehensively as I can, just set out the thinking. What are the assumptions behind that argument? And so I'll tell you what I argue in the book are kind of the 5 key assumptions about Iran's post-revolutionary political behavior, what I call the regime change argument. And then I'll give you just a brief summary of my assessment of that evidence, some of which supports the idea that Iran's system is intransigent, not amenable to reform, and some of which suggests that that reasoning may be somewhat flawed. So the first assumption that you find in the literature on Iran is that the Iranian regime remains and will remain for the foreseeable future a revolutionary political movement. And here I have a picture that I took in 2013 when I visited Iran, of a portrait of a martyr, someone who was martyred in the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988. And you see these very prominently displayed and all around public spaces in Iran. So trying to keep the kind of revolutionary fervor and spirit alive through portraits such as these. What's some of the reasoning behind this assumption? Well, the reasoning is something like political elites are true believers. They're guided by revolutionary religious ideology rather than pragmatism. The regime has not and cannot adapt to the prevailing international order, and that Iran's foreign policy will remain fixated on exporting the Islamic Revolution. It will remain hostile toward its Gulf Arab neighbors and Israel, and will resist the dominance of outside powers like the United States. So what do I find? And based on my reading of the last 40 years of Iranian history and reassessment of the constitution, I find that while revolutionary political ideology persists among some, particularly among more hardline or what we'd call principlist or conservative factions in Iran, on the other hand, moderates and reformers are now and have been since the very inception of the revolution increasingly pragmatic in their ideological worldview. So if you walk away from my talk today with one idea, I would like it to be that based on my research, the idea that the meaning of the revolution itself is settled and is kind of universally agreed upon in Iran is simply untrue. And you know, Bill, I'm sure in your study of Russia and the Soviet Union, maybe you can see a parallel that I think to the Bolshevik Revolution. You know, the other factions competing against Lenin simply didn't just go away once the Bolsheviks were in ascendance. Of course, there was campaigns of repression and so on, and that's definitely true in Iran as well. But there have always been those who imagine the revolution otherwise, and that continues to this day. One anecdote I'll just share is we see this borne out in public opinion surveys conducted in Iran. Now, conducting public opinion polls in authoritarian settings has a whole range of problems. It's not perfect, but there have been some in recent years that I think have validity and that I think show us present some very interesting findings. And one I'll just briefly share with you. There is an independent research institute based in the Netherlands called the Group for Analyzing and Measuring Attitudes in Iran. And what they use, obviously there's a challenge of conducting in-person polling. So they look at social media networking applications like Twitter, WhatsApp, Telegram, Instagram, all of which are widely used in Iran. And in April 2019, they produced an interesting study, which I detail further in the book, where they asked respondents, nationally representative sample of Iranians, a simple binary yes/no question about whether they would vote for an Islamic Republic in a hypothetical free referendum. So 40 years after the revolution, if you had a chance to vote, would you vote yes or no? And their finding was really striking, where they found that 79.4% of respondents said no to an Islamic Republic, and only 20.6%, just over 1 in 5, said yes. So again, that's just one piece that in the book I detail a whole pattern of surveys, not just by this group, but also another firm called Iran Poll, which conducts telephone interviewing. Also, World Values Survey has conducted a few waves of its survey in Iran. If we have any political scientists in the audience, you'll be familiar with World Values Survey. And all of it disrupts this notion that Iranian society is somehow still captivated by the revolutionary fervor that was present in the mid to late 1970s. Also, we see this borne out in the political factions in the country. So while Iran's political spectrum is certainly more constrained than, say, a Western European democracy, there is still some difference. Voters are still presented with some degree of choice at the polls. And the literature on Iran describes this usually as a spectrum between reformists and principlists. In the interest of time, I will kind of just give you a brief overview of what that means. Basically, principlists are arguing in favor of a literal interpretation of Iran's constitution, are much more dubious about any secular influences in society, and adhere to kind of a more austere fundamentalist interpretation of Islam more generally. On the other hand, there are reformist candidates, even within the clerical establishment, like, for example, former President Hassan Rouhani, who, there's some debate, is he a moderate, a pragmatist, or reformist? We can put a number of different names on it, but certainly ideological distinct from the more hardline factions. And so here I show you the 6 candidates who were approved to run in the 2017 presidential election. And I've drawn a vertical red line here, kind of separating, as I see it, the 3 more reform-oriented candidates and the 3 more principlist candidates. The most recent presidential election in Iran in 2021, the current president, Ebrahim Raisi, was kind of the most principlist or most hardline conservative candidate of the 7. An interesting trend in 2021 was some contraction of the reformist space. Fewer reformist candidates were approved by the Guardian Council to run for office, and yet they're still there. So it begs the question, why approve any candidates at all? Why have elections at all, unless there's at least some recognition that there is a diversity of views in society about how the country should be governed, at least from its elected officials. Okay, so don't worry too much about the details of all these names. I'm just trying to show you we see a spectrum in interpreting what the revolution means and how it should move forward. Okay, so what's the second big assumption that I encounter in the literature on Iran? Well, it's this idea that the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, singularly dominates Iran's politics. That the other branches, sure, they exist, but they really are just paper tigers and they have no meaningful political power. The reasoning here is really that it's the supreme leader that wields all executive power. And most importantly, the supreme leader has control over what in political science we call the coercive apparatus of the state, basically the military, the police, the criminal justice system. And that any power that may have been vested in the parliament and the president is effectively blocked by the intervention of the Guardian Council. Just to summarize, the Guardian Council is a 12-member body. 6 members are directly appointed by the supreme leader. 6 are appointed by the head of the judiciary, who the head of the judiciary themselves is appointed by the supreme leader. So you can see a kind of concentration of power. And the Guardian Council, their main tasks are to vet candidates who wish to stand for elected office and disqualify those who they find lacking in the revolutionary bona fides. And also the Guardian Council oversees legislation passed by the parliament and can invalidate any law passed by the parliament for not adhering to Islamic principles. So because of this, some have said, well, all power is with the supreme leaders, so the other branches don't matter. Here in this picture, you see from a couple years ago, the heads of the 3 branches of government. On the far left, Ebrahim Raisi, who was the head of the judiciary prior to becoming president. In the center, former President Hassan Rouhani, and on the right, former Speaker of Parliament, Ali Larijani. What do I find in response to this assumption? Well, I'll just briefly go over this table that I have in the book. So what I find by revisiting the Constitution and thinking about the last 43 years of Iran's development as contingent, right, as one path among many, I find that the Constitution actually empowers the other branches of government in significant ways. This is less a constitutional problem and more a feature of Iran's particular development of the last 43 years, which was born in, the revolution unfolds in February, March of 1979. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein and Iraq invade Iran. And Iran is immediately after the revolution, is immediately in war, and things tighten up, things lock down, power concentrates around the supreme leader. much of that concentration, as we know, if we study authoritarian political systems, once an authoritarian leader grabs power, it's very rare for them to voluntarily give it back. And in large part, I argue that that's what has defined these first 4 decades of Iran's political development. I argue that the dominance of the supreme leader in Iran's politics is more a function of the specific office holder, first Ayatollah Khomeini, now Ayatollah Khamenei, rather than an intrinsic feature of the office itself. Imagine if you would write a book about the features of the American presidency only having the evidence of George Washington and John Adams. Could you conceive of how the presidency would have changed in the 20th century? Could you even visualize what the modern presidency looks like? So it's worth, I think, reminding ourselves, we only have 43 years of evidence here. The Islamic Republic system is very young, it's very new, only 2 occupants of the supreme leader position. So do we really know everything it could be? When I looked at the Constitution, I was really struck by actually the flexibility, or I mean, it could even say the weakness of the institution of the supreme leader in theory. And I just am showing you here, there's a very interesting section in the Constitution where it details, well, what happens when the supreme leader leaves office, when the supreme leader dies. It imagines this interim period prior to the appointment of a new supreme leader. That office could be, instead, rather than an individual, it would be a supreme council. And the supreme council is composed of a number of key members of government: the president, the speaker of parliament, the head of the judiciary, and so on, members of the Guardian Council. And the Supreme Council is given significantly less powers than the supreme leader. For example, the Supreme Council, these are the X's I have shown here. I know it's a lot on this slide, but we can talk about it more in the Q&A if you're curious. So for example, one power given to the supreme leader is holding supreme command of the armed forces. The Supreme Council, however, is not vested with that power. Instead, it's given to the president. So it's fascinating from a theoretical point of view, is that then in theory, could a new supreme leader not also allow that power to be devolved to another branch of government? Here are some others: that the supreme leader is tasked, for example, with resolving disputes and coordinating relations between the 3 branches, but this interim Supreme Council is not given that power. All of this is to say, well, where do all of those other executive functions go in this critical transition period when there's a succession from one supreme leader to another? They're vested to the other branches. So that at least presents a hypothetical argument that one could make that, well, if the Constitution says that's okay in times of transition, why could we not at least conceive of a supreme leader that is less assertive in some of these other executive functions? Okay, I see I just have about 10 minutes left, so I'll move through assumptions 3, 4, and 5 a little quicker. Assumption 3 in, again, the regime change argument, and the notion that the Islamic Republic system is completely not amenable to reform in any way, is this idea that elections not only have not, but cannot lead to any political change. The argument in support of this is basically the idea is, regardless of who wins an election, the government policy remains the same. Policy is not responsive to public preferences, and that the parties and candidates who are allowed to stand for office do not present any meaningful ideological choice for voters. So, based on what I showed you in that spectrum, you can guess that my argument, that I developed further in the book, is that I don't think this is as strong of an assumption as one often finds in the literature. Basically, I think it mistakes what has occurred in a very particular context in the last several decades as the only possible outcome, which I don't think is correct. And I think if we look earnestly at the history, for example, of presidential elections in Iran, which I show you here in this table that's in the book, we see some interesting things. We see quite high levels of voter turnout, particularly from the late 90s onward. We see many candidates attempting to register to stand for office. And what I really want to draw your attention to is this role played by the Guardian Council in disqualifying a very high percentage of candidates. That this was not how it was in the first presidential election after the revolution in January 1980. You can see 124 candidates registered to stand in that presidential election, 96 of whom were approved by the Guardian Council. So 77.41% of those candidates who registered were approved. That election at least gives us some proof of principle that the Guardian Council could play a less restrictive role in disqualifying candidates. Very quickly after that election, again, events intervene. We can't tell this story completely in a vacuum against international relations. Attempts to undo the revolution early on, assassination of a prime minister and a president. And then, as I mentioned, in September of 1980, invasion by Iraq, and things tighten up. Fewer candidates attempt to register, fewer candidates are approved. And so, we then see this situation that has taken hold now, where around 1% of those candidates who attempt to register to run for office are approved. Not shown here is the most recent presidential election, which took place on June 18th of 2021, where Ebrahim Raisi won with 72% of the vote. Of some 600 candidates who registered, only 7 were approved, about 1.1%. And what was so important about that most recent election is the turnout. It was only 48.5%, which is the lowest number. Even there was higher levels of turnout during the Iran-Iraq war than there was in 2021. So a lot of discussion now about Iran was how much of that had to do with the pandemic. We're not really sure. But my own opinion is that I think it reflects quite a high degree of voter apathy and frustration with the candidates who were approved for office. So I wanted to just share that. I'll move on from this. We can revisit it later, but this is data about the role the Guardian Council has played in vetting legislation passed by Parliament. Again, maybe in the interest of time, I'll just move on from this. There is some variability, is one of the arguments I make in the book, of the kind of assertiveness of the Guardian Council in this role. It's not just uniformly disqualifying every piece of legislation, or 90% of the legislation passed by Parliament. There have been some instances, really interesting period actually from 2000 to 2004, when there was a reform-oriented Parliament and a reform-oriented president, where the Guardian Council actually backed off a little bit, or backed off at least from its historical pattern to allow more legislation to pass in, I guess we could say, in a more democratic way, where elected offices were the ones authoring the pieces of legislation. The fourth assumption, and I just have about 5 minutes left, so I'll move through these very quickly. The fourth assumption is this idea that society has no role, that society is totally repressed, and that efforts to reform the system cannot break out from this. I have a chapter all about social movements, where I look at women's movement, movement for environmental justice, movement for economic justice, and simply the evidence doesn't bear this out. There have been several critical junctures where political mobilization at the level of society has affected the government to change its behavior. Of course, social change toward greater political rights and civil liberties has been slow. That's an understatement. But movements oriented around specific issues, such as women's rights and environmentalism, have had some limited success. And some of you may have, following recent developments, the death of a young woman, Mahsa Amini, in police custody recently has invigorated again the women's movement in Iran really quite courageously, with many activists making public stands and demonstrations of their disapproval of this case. If we look at the last 40 years, it has led to some change where women have gained more access to public space and public visibility than it had been in, say, the early 1980s. Certainly, comparing Iran to other states in the region, Iranian women have significantly higher levels of engagement in education, for example, engagement in the labor force participation, I should say. So it's important, I think, to have a comparative perspective to say the situation on gender equality from our perspective in the United States looks one way, but if we apply a regional perspective and compare, for example, these measures of like education and labor force participation of Iranian women to, say, women in Saudi Arabia or other Gulf countries, there's some cause for optimism. I could put it that way. The fifth and final assumption in the last 2 minutes here that I encounter in the regime change argument is that political socialization through state-sponsored institutions like the education system in Iran, the state media, that these institutions basically have been successful in shaping public opinion in favor of the regime. That people have drank the Kool-Aid, Iranians have drank the Kool-Aid, and they just support every narrative that the regime tries to disseminate through these channels. And here I have an interesting picture of a guy in Tehran on the street using his smartphone to take a picture of a graffiti art of Iranian filmmaker Asghar Farhadi. If you've seen his probably most famous film, is called A Separation. It won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Feature, I think in 2011 or 2012. And he subsequently won that award again for another movie called The Salesman. And this picture just was so fascinating to me. It's using graffiti, first of all. Medium comes from urban landscapes in the United States. It's a picture of a filmmaker, another medium that's outside of state control, a complete state control, I should say. And he's using a smartphone probably to share that picture on a social media app. So what I try to outline in the book is all of the ways in which Iranians elide the kind of state-sponsored institutions, get other sources of information, and are connected basically to global opinion and global trends. So what I find, just to summarize, is that Iranian public opinion is varied and often expresses opposition to pro-regime narratives. I mentioned the general attitude survey from the Netherlands. I'll share with you one more before I wrap up. I find that censorship and indoctrination have proven increasingly ineffective as tools of political socialization for the state. So just to share one other poll, there is a group based out of Toronto, Canada, called Iran Poll, that has been doing really fascinating work in trying to understand public opinion in Iran now for several years. They don't look at social media. Instead, they use a method called computer-assisted telephone interviewing, where they call people who have telephones, landlines in Iran, They get a nationally representative, statistically significant sample, and they ask them a whole range of questions, sometimes about a specific issue like the nuclear program. And they also ask them some general confidence measures, things that we would see in like the World Values Survey or Gallup polling, for example. And I wanted to share with you just a couple pieces of information that came out from a survey that they conducted in late June, early July of this year. Just again, illustrating this point that I mentioned, that people are not whole cloth buying the kind of framing, official pro-regime framing that they so often encounter in state-run media. So, for example, they have been asking this question since May 2015 on the economy. They say, in your opinion, how good or bad is our country's general economic situation? And what we can see is, if we combine the very bad and somewhat bad, 3/4 of Iranians in July 2022 said the outlook is bad. Well, if you study state media, it's all very positive and saying we're resilient and things are looking up and things are improving. And yet, even in a case where, if you can imagine someone in Iran getting a phone call and then being prompted with all these questions, even if they might be inclined to say things are good, if they're kind of afraid of maybe who is on the other line, still 3/4 are saying the economic situation is bad. So probably it would be reasonable to assume that those bad numbers are actually lower than maybe they should be. You can see, how this has changed over time. Things have gotten increasingly pessimistic on the economy. Another economic measure they ask right now, do you think economic conditions in Iran as a whole are getting better or worse? So looking to the trajectory. And 65% of respondents in the most recent poll said things are getting worse. If state socialization was working perfectly, it stands to reason that that number should be a lot lower. A couple, if you'll indulge me just very quickly, thinking about Bill and thinking about Russia, they've recently started asking, they ask favorability about countries. And so they ask the respondent, please indicate to what degree you have a favorable or unfavorable view of this country. Thinking about Russia, they have data back to July 2014. And you can see here the kind of critical one that we'd be interested in is like what changed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Well, the very favorable decreased from September 2021 to July 2022, about 4%. The somewhat favorable decreased, about 12%, and the unfavorables are up similarly. So again, it's just a snapshot, but based on this one source, it's seeming like the Iranian public is leaning toward not supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. One final thing I could share just about President Raisi, who I'm sure now you're seeing in media with the UN General Assembly. I think he gave an interview with 60 Minutes that either has come out or will be coming out. But the Iran poll asked some questions about Raisi, which I'll just go down to very quickly. It says here, thinking about the next 4 years of President Raisi's term, how confident are you that he'll be able to do each of the following? And so we just have 2 data points in this because he just came into office last year, but already we can see some erosion of confidence. So do the Iranian people think he can lower inflation, which is at all-time highs, and people are really hurting in Iran right now with inflation? The very confidence down from 21 to 13, somewhat confident from 51 to 36. What about employment? Similarly, dropping confidence. And then the final one on the domestic front, which I'll share with you, are you confident he can root out corruption? Down 33.9 in September 2021 to 22.7 as of July of 2022. And the somewhat's also kind of flat, but less confidence that he can root out corruption, which was one of his big platforms in running for office. So again, here's where we stand. Raisi, in now the second year of his presidential term, a lot of questions about Ayatollah Khamenei and his future as supreme leader. So thank you so much for your time today. And we'd be fascinated to hear your questions. Again, there's the book. You can get it at the publisher's website, or it's available on Amazon. And actually, I'm happy to say it's available at the University of Iowa Library as well. So you can get rent a free copy if there's any students in the audience. So thank you so much.
Great. You've been listening to Dr. Robert Assadi talking about post-revolutionary Iran. We now move to the question and answer portion of our program. Please submit your questions via the chat function at the bottom of your viewing screen. Feel free to turn your video function on, but please keep yourself muted. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, ICFRC wants to thank its members and donors for their continued support. If you would like to join ICFRC or make a gift to support our programs, please go to icfrc.org. Maybe I will start off with a question. I would love to hear more about the erosion in economic confidence that your chart showed just in the last year, I guess, basically. Besides inflation, what are the kind of key problems that the economy faces, and are there any mechanisms in the institutions you've explained to us for changing course when the economy is doing poorly?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So this has been, I think, one of the really big dilemmas in post-revolutionary Iran more generally. The idea that if you have a regime premised on religious legitimacy that's governed by clerics, how do you administer an economy? What about all of the kind of technocratic and bureaucratic know-how that's needed to organize a functioning economy? And so the big shift really happened in the early 1990s, that under a president named Rafsanjani, who was kind of more of a pragmatist, that basically he advanced this idea that we need to build more of a technocratic infrastructure to actually export oil and build critical infrastructure and overcome the effects of economic sanctions and isolation. So what we've seen, I think, since then is a kind of oscillation between reformist presidents who are more willing to invest in attracting highly skilled people who may have varying opinions about the appropriateness of religious government and all of the rules and strictures and so on. And on the other hand, more conservative leaders who are less willing to make an accommodation for such individuals or to attract kind of people who may have left the country. Obviously, I think brain drain is a huge problem. There's actually a great research group based out of Stanford called the Iran 2040 Project, which looks primarily at these types of questions of the soundness of Iran's economy. Our audience may be interested. You can find, they have a number of publicly accessible reports. But really the big problems are inflation that is in the thousands of percents, that is affecting staple items, unemployment, underemployment. Iran has this dilemma of having a highly educated society. It's next to, I think, only Turkey in the region as the highest number of individuals with post-secondary degrees, but then not having opportunities within the country for those folks. So then they end up in, Western Europe or the United States or other Gulf countries. So it's a real dilemma. So much of the big firms are state-owned. So, there's this phenomenon of state-owned enterprises, which, as you well know from studying Russia, comes with a lot of inefficiencies and opportunities for corruption and graft. And that, I think, has been extremely detrimental on top of economic sanctions, which have squeezed the country even further. So it's, yeah, beyond that, I'm not sure what else to add, but it's, and I mean, I guess the final thing I can say is in the last 3 to 4 years, we've actually seen now for the first time street demonstrations about precisely this issue. So, you know, if we remember back to late 2010, 2011, that's what kickstarted the Arab uprisings, was, you know, really was an economic frustration. And so I think the regime is very cautious about that and has used repression to put down those demonstrations, but demonstrators keep coming to the streets. And a lot of it is motivated by these concerns about economic deprivation.
Yeah, well, apart from the demonstrators in the streets part of it, there are a lot of eerie similarities to Brezhnev era Soviet Union, I think. So our next question asks you to talk about the succession. Maybe you could begin by telling us about the health scare that Ayatollah Khamenei had just a few days ago, and you know, talk about the succession and what the wobbliness of his health might mean for Iran's standing and internal stability.
Absolutely, yeah. So as I said, Ayatollah Khamenei, he's 83 years old. He has been in power for 33 years. So he's one of the longest, you know, we think like Putin has been in power for a long time, but he's like new to the scene compared to Ayatollah Khamenei. Yeah, about his health scare, I mean, there has been endless jokes inside Iran about it. He had a bowel obstruction, so you can imagine, if you're not a fan of the regime, what you might say that he was full of. And I mean, I'm not to be crude, but these are jokes. People may, as you well know, in Russia, you know, there's a lot of humor around these types of things. Yeah, it's unclear, you know, his recovery. I could say like life expectancy for men in Iran is somewhere in the low 70s, but another joke that is very common among Iranians is life expectancy for the clerics is a whole nother, they're a whole nother category, right? Like male, female, and clergy or something like that. So what happens in terms of succession? I mentioned the Assembly of Experts. This is an 88-member body. They are directly elected. They serve 8-year terms. Their most recent election was in 2016, so we know who the members are on that body. That body is dominated by more hardline and conservative factions. It's chaired by a man named Ahmad Jannati, who is himself 95 years old, a religious cleric. He's also the chairman of the Guardian Council, so he has these very critical roles. That body will convene and they will deliberate. So we don't, you know, it's only ever happened once. And actually the video of that deliberation where Ayatollah Khamenei was chosen, it was released a few years ago by the Islamic Republic. So you can actually find it on YouTube. If you search 1989 Assembly of Experts, you'll see, and it's very informal. Basically, some influential figures under the guidance of the chair may nominate someone or suggest someone, and it kind of moves from there. So perhaps something like the convening of the College of Cardinals when there needs to be a new pope selected. You know, there's a lot of looking into the crystal ball and prognostication of who's a front runner, who might be the next candidate. I try to steer away from that as much as I can, but if I had to, you know, say one person, it would be the current president, Ebrahim Raisi, who I believe is in his mid-60s, so young by as far as these things go. And there is the precedent of only one case that when Ayatollah Khamenei was selected, he held the office of president. So there's some notion that maybe the president should be Raisi is a cleric himself. So he has the kind of religious background. But the real answer is no one really knows how it might unfold.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to jump to this question. Is the imprisonment of Westerners in Iran simply to gain leverage in their negotiations with Western governments, or does the government/judicial system truly believe these individuals to be guilty of espionage, etc.?
Yeah, great question. This is something obviously we read about a lot in Western press, and is a really, really very important issue. I can't, I won't pretend to know the mind of judicial officials in Iran as to whether they believe or don't believe the veracity of their allegations. I would, I would just say that there's been a number of cases where, based on the available evidence, it is hard to imagine that there is not some degree of geopolitical calculus happening. And I'm thinking particularly of the case of Maziar Bahari from a few years ago. He wrote a book about his experience of being imprisoned. He was being interviewed by a correspondent on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. And based on that interview, he was imprisoned. Actually, there was a film made about it called Rosewater that was directed by Jon Stewart. And I mean, that case alone, the thing about it that, is so frustrating, or that's so vexing, I think, when you look at the judicial system in Iran, is it's almost Kafka-esque in a way in trying to determine what actually are the rules, who implements the rules, is the same standard being applied to all individuals, and it certainly seems not to be the case. And so, I mean, I also think about the cases of journalists in Iran. The former New York Times bureau chief, Tehran bureau chief, Thomas Erdbrink, who was a brilliant reporter. He had a documentary, PBS Frontline, called Our Man in Tehran. He presents his experience. He married an Iranian woman. He learned Persian. He settled in Iran. And just a few years ago, during a kind of conservative resurgence, his press credential was taken away. He faced a pretty dire situation in the country. So, yeah, that would be, I guess, how I'd respond to that question. But it's such an important question.
Right. What does the leadership in Iran still hope to gain in Syria? And how do you see Iran's relation with Russia regarding Syria? Will Iran still consider Russia as an ally in the Middle East?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. So this is actually what I'm working on now, is trying to understand Iran's relationship with Russia in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this is what I've been focusing on, kind of going back to foreign policy. The piece about Syria is Iran and Syria have a very special relationship, to borrow a term from the US and the UK. Syria is the Islamic Republic of Iran's oldest ally in the Arab world. They complement each other's interests in a number of ways. For Iran, Syria allows them a conduit into the Israeli-Palestinian situation, a conduit to get to Lebanon and connect with Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is was basically created by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in the early 1980s. Their admission of that case. People, I think, on the Iran-Syria front often mistake that this has something to do with Shiaism, that the Assad family are members of the Alawite sect, and that has some affinity with Shiites in Iran. I think that is a red herring. Much more, the connection is about a complementary strategic interests. Going forward in the future, I think, again, it's unclear. So much depends on political developments in Syria. There is regarding Russia, though, there is a very evident disconnect, I think, that the Iranian public blames Russia for the war in Ukraine. They don't buy the argument that this was somehow a provocation by NATO and the United States and that Russia was acting defensively. The Iranian public doesn't buy that narrative. Close, approval of Russia has declined, as I showed you. I think, the Iranian government, in that famous UN General Assembly resolution that happened quite early on after Russia's invasion, Iran was one of the 60 some countries who abstained. So they didn't neither condemn nor support the resolution condemning Russia's invasion. So I think initially there was some fence sitting. More recently, of course, Putin and Erdogan came to Tehran and met with President Raisi. So maybe Iran is somehow trying to reestablish this nexus with Turkey, which has been very tricky. I guess my long story short would be, I think Iran's relationship with Syria is much more robust than possibly what Iran's relationship with Russia might look like going forward. Oh, I think you're still muted there, Bill.
Yes. All right. Thank you, everyone. I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Assadi for his presentation today and for sharing his expertise. Robert, to express our appreciation, you will receive one of what we like to call our highly coveted ICFRC mugs for coffee, tea, or the beverage of your choice. And we will coordinate delivery details with you very soon. I would like to also notify you that ICFRC has 2 evening programs next week. One on Wednesday evening, September 28th at 7 p.m. in the Old Capitol, featuring journalist Sarah Shays, and one on Thursday evening, September 29th in the Adler Journalism Building on the U of I campus, featuring Dr. Cullen Hendricks. We will send out email announcements soon about these 2 programs, which you can attend in person or view via live streaming. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are adjourned.